Good morning, Taos First Baptist. I'm sorry that I'm not with you this morning, but I sure am praying for you. I'm here at the Sea of Galilee, and I want to wish you a happy Sunday morning. I am so glad today that I've got my friend missionary Paul Miles and his wife Lena who are with us today, and they're going to be there fellowshipping with you, and Paul's going to be teaching and preaching some very good things about the Word of God. I know you're going to be blessed by them. We've supported them as missionaries to the Ukraine and continue to support them in prayers and encouragement, and I am praying for you while you are gone. And Paul, thank you for filling the pulpit while I am gone. God bless each one of you. I look forward to being back with you very soon. Shalom. Good morning, Taos First Baptist. I'm sorry that I'm not with you this morning, but I sure am praying for you. I'm here at the Sea of Galilee, and I want to wish you a happy Sunday morning. I am so glad today that I've got my friend missionary Paul Miles and his wife Lena who are with us today, and they're going to be there fellowshipping with you. And
I've heard people say that there are people in the Bible that never really existed, that the biblical authors just sort of invented these stories, plugged in a few fictional characters here and there. And if the Bible is making up characters, then we really can't believe it. So we'll talk about that. Another common objection is that the different authors contradict each other, that they're telling different stories, they can't get their act together. And another one is that the biblical prophecies are unreliable, they're just guessing, or they're extremely vague, and they can't help but be true. So let's take a look at some of these objections. First one, some of the people in the Bible don't even exist. Well, we keep having archaeological discoveries just pop up here and there. For example, the Pilate dedication stone is a stone that has Pontius Pilate's name written on it. So anyone that tried to attack Pontius Pilate and say, oh, he's fictional, he didn't really exist, well, archaeology says otherwise. People have tried to say that King David never existed. Then the Tell Dance still pops up in 1993, boop, and it's got King David's name written right there in plain stone. But perhaps my favorite one of all is what I like to call the Great Belshazzar debate. You're probably familiar with Belshazzar. He's the guy in the book of Daniel, right? King Belshazzar. And then the hand comes and writes on the wall, and he gets scared and offers the third place in the kingdom to anyone that can explain this. And Daniel steps up and explains it, and quite a miraculous occasion. Well, not everybody has always believed in the existence of Belshazzar. This guy, Cesar von Lengerte, I probably pronounced that wrong, it's German. He wrote a book called Das Buch Danijela, in which he essentially attacks the book of Daniel. And he says things like, there is no historical basis whatsoever on which such an account can rest, talking about Belshazzar. The whole must be pure fiction. The whole thing is a palpable forgery got up merely to magnify Daniel. It's improbable altogether, if not impossible. This is a biblical scholar speaking in 1835. And what he's basing this on, in part, is Herodotus, a Greek historian that lived about 60 years after the events of Daniel. And Herodotus talks about the fall of Babylon. He mentioned Cyrus, a biblical character, coming in and attacking, and how Cyrus rerouted the Euphrates River, and then the guys snuck into the city underneath the gate and all this cool stuff. And he doesn't mention Belshazzar. Of course, Herodotus' history of this invasion should come as no real surprise, being as how Jeremiah said that Babylon fell suddenly, and you might be able to interpret some of Isaiah to say that he was specifically telling how Babylon fell, but that's none of my business. Lengerke goes on to say, the name Belshazzar is a mistaken one. The name of the last king was Namaded, not Belshazzar. The writer has given us a mere figment instead of a real name. Daniel just made it up. The whole story is disfigured and falsified. by the author, who was neither an eyewitness of the occurrences nor accurately acquainted with the history of them. Right? So the person that wrote Daniel was not Daniel. He did not live. He did not meet Belshazzar. Belshazzar is fake. And mind you that this was all written in 1835. The actual translation is from a commentary on Daniel that was done in 1850. But then something strange happened in 1854. They discovered a Nabonidus cylinder in Ur. You remember Ur from the Bible, Ur of the Chaldees, that's where Abraham is from. I'm a little bit of an Ur nerd because I lived there in Iraq next to the city of Ur, and we could go and look at the ruins. Really interesting place, so I kind of like all things Ur. But when they were exploring Ur in 1854, so a couple of decades after that whole thing that we just read, they discovered this cylinder written by Nabonidus, the last king there, as he said. And he says, "As for me, Nabonidus, king of Babylon, ... and he mentions, as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, my offspring, ... right? So he specifically names his son Belshazzar. Well, this shakes up the community a bit. Frederick William Farrar, another biblical scholar, who happened to be one of the pallbearers at Charles Darwin's funeral. That's a little suspicious, but whatever. He is a biblical scholar, so he said, okay, so there was a Belshazzar. We do possess the clay cylinder of Nabunid, different spellings for the same name. But if we look at Herodotus, this Belshazzar that did exist, he was never the king, right? So there was a Belshazzar, but there was not a king Belshazzar. So Daniel, okay, he maybe got a name right, but he's wrong. There was no king Belshazzar. Then another archaeological thing pops up. This one actually popped up a few years before he wrote that, so he just was out of the know. This is the verse account of Nabonidus, in which he entrusted the army to his eldest son, the firstborn. The troops in the country who ordered under his command, he let everything go and trusted the kingship to him, to his first son. Who is his first son? Belshazzar. So there was a Belshazzar. He was the king. Everyone's jaw dropped. And nobody any longer attacks the existence of King Belshazzar. So these kind of stories pop up throughout archaeology. So some of the people in the Bible didn't even exist. If people are saying that, then perhaps they are just out of touch with other archaeological discoveries, or perhaps we just haven't discovered any archaeology to back it up yet. But the Bible is a historic document. We have no reason to doubt the existence of these people. Another common attack is that the biblical authors contradict each other. The Skeptic's Annotated Bible is a fun little resource to look at online. And they ask the question, well, what was written above the cross? We have Matthew, who says that above the cross was written, "This is Jesus, King of the Jews." Mark said, "The King of the Jews." Luke said, "This is the King of the Jews." John said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Four different gospel authors, four different accounts. Each of them has something different. Therefore, we cannot trust the Bible, right? Wrong. What do we do with this? Anyone want to take a guess? Anyone have a theory? It's really quite simple. Above the cross was probably written, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." It's okay for authors, biblical authors, to reduce the amount of information that they give. The issue comes whenever they misrepresent the Bible, misrepresent history, or if they add to history. But it's perfectly fine to reduce the amount of information that you record in there. The Sermon on the Mount can be read aloud in about 15 minutes. Do we think that Jesus really spoke for only 15 minutes? Well, it's probable that he probably gave a drawn-out sermon, and Matthew recorded the highlights, okay? That's perfectly fine. That's within the realm of biblical inerrancy. Another one that the skeptics will bring up: when did Jesus' temple tantrum occur? Their words, not mine. They say at the beginning of Christ's ministry, and they quote John, the day of his triumphal entry, they quote Luke, and the day after his triumphal entry, Matthew and Mark. This is another common attack. Okay. First of all, it's a misrepresentation. John does indeed include the cleansing of the temple, not the temper tantrum, but the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of Christ's ministry. Luke does not specify that it happened the day of the temple entry. He simply says that after Jesus entered the temple, after the triumphal entry, he cleansed the temple. So we have 3 saying after the triumphal entry, 1 saying at the beginning of the ministry. How do we reconcile these? Quite simply. Jesus cleared the temple more than once. Why couldn't he come in, cleanse the temple at the beginning of the ministry and at the end? In fact, it's entirely possible that he came in a 3rd time. Every year on Passover, he could have come in to cleanse the temple, right? We have no reason to say that he didn't, but biblically we can't say definitely that he did more than twice, but we know that as a minimum, twice he did. Usually whenever people try to bring out contradictions in the Bible, they're extremely easy to reconcile, just like that. Another attack that we'll hear is that the biblical prophecies are unreliable. Some will say, oh, it's kind of like Nostradamus. They're just very vague and so unclear. If you apply a vague spiritual hermeneutic to them, then certainly you'll find some way for it to be true. That's the way that some people say. Here's one quote from a Bible scholar, C.A. Strine. He's got glasses, a tie, and a nice haircut, so you can't help but believe him, right? But his words are, prophets want to activate certain behaviors in their audiences, not prognosticate future events. They are like parents warning children against foolish behavior and encouraging good behavior, not weather forecasters attempting to tell you whether or not you'll need an umbrella at noontime tomorrow. Okay, so according to this view, the prophets are essentially using God to scare people into good behavior, right? Behave or else God will bring his judgment, right? Now his proof text for this is Jeremiah 18, 5 through 10. And he does bring up a good point that here we've got but if, right? And I will change my mind. But if it does evil, I will change my mind. There are indeed some prophecies in which God comes and says, behave or I will do this. There are conditional covenants, right? If you obey the Mosaic law, you will be blessed. If you do not, then you will go into exile, right? We do see this in a few places. But Dr. Strine is completely out of line saying that every single prophecy is like this. In fact, if we just flip a couple of pages down the road, we'll see in Jeremiah 29, for thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good work toward you, in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Now, according to Strine's view, the prophets are just manipulating God and trying to intimidate people into behavior. The question I have is, where do you see the word if anywhere in this promise? It does not exist. God made a very specific promise to Israel. let's look at a timeline. In Jewish history, this was a time when Israel had gone into exile, and Jeremiah receives the 70-year prophecy saying that there will be 70 years after the Babylonian exile, it will come to an end. No matter what Israel does, God promises this. Okay. Further, Isaiah comes along and God gives him some more prophecy. God confirms to Isaiah that the Babylonian exile will come to an end within the 70-year timeline. And he even goes further and says, I will restore Jerusalem. Then, Isaiah also receives another prophecy about the death of Christ. Every single one of these, by the way, came to be within the perfect timelines, right? So it's not like the prophets are just trying to manipulate people. No. Mr. Strine is just out of touch with history. But if that's not enough, further, we get the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel. God tells him, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. The word for weeks here is 7, so there will be 7 sevens. That means 7 years. Does that make sense? So unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Any math experts want to tell us how much 62 weeks is? So it's King James English. The score is 20, right? So 62 is 62. And the street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, where is the if here? Is God saying, well, if you do this, then good things will happen if you do that? No, he is saying this is how it's going to be. Okay? So, go back to our timeline. Daniel is over here. We've already talked about Jeremiah's prophecy, which came here about the end of the 70-year period. Isaiah told us about this and the restoration of Jerusalem. Daniel comes in and fills some gaps. He talks about what would later become Artaxerxes' decree to restore Jerusalem. He gives a specific time frame of 49 years before Jerusalem is restored. This is in a greater 483-year period, at the end of which we will have the death of Christ, earlier told about it by Isaiah and others, by the way. And then we have a siege of Jerusalem that will take place after that. Every single one of these came to be. No ifs, ands, or buts. There is still a 7-year period that Daniel told us about, and John also told us a few more details about it. This has not come to pass yet, but I'll tell you this much. If God was right about the end of the Babylonian exile, Artaxerxes' decree, restoration of Jerusalem, death of Christ, and the siege of Jerusalem, I tend to think God probably knows what he's talking about, and we can probably believe him when he says that the 7-year future week is going to come along as well. So when people try to attack biblical prophecies, they're just uninformed probably. They just don't know how detailed these things are and how they came to pass within the proper timing. So those are the 3 objections that we hear the most, that the people in the Bible are fictional, that the biblical authors contradict each other, and that the biblical prophecies are unreliable. And they just do not have any foundation in reality. How much time do we have? Oh, another 15. Oh, okay. Great. Let's see. Would you mind opening the next presentation? Okay. Yes, number 2. Okay, thank you. Alrighty. Yeah. So, that was our talk on higher criticism. Are there any questions about that before we move on? Okay. I wanted to make sure that we got through that talk because it's extremely important to understand that we can trust the Bible. But I'd like to talk a little bit about ourselves too. My name is Paul Miles. This is my wife, Lena. We are missionaries to Ukraine. I moved out there in 2011. Lynn has been living there since 1985. She was born out there. I haven't always been a Christian. I was raised in a Christian church, but the church really didn't teach the Bible systematically and detailed. They really didn't give us a reason to believe the Bible. We talked about a few of the basic doctrines, faith alone in Christ alone, right? Eternal security, these are very important. But when you really boil it down, me and a lot of my friends, we just did not have a reason to trust God. So a lot of us apostatized. We abandoned Christianity altogether as soon as we left the youth group, graduated high school, and whatever. And I was one of them. I abandoned Christianity. I joined the army, spent some time in Iraq. You saw the pictures there. And whenever I returned, I had a real difficulty reconciling all the evils around me with my worldview. I just didn't have a worldview to back it up. And I had a really difficult time reintegrating to society, made some very terrible choices, and I ended up in federal prison. While I was in federal prison, some Christians reached out to me and sent me some books on apologetics and stuff. And as I searched for truth, I realized that there in the prison system, a lot of us were there because of snitches, right? The way that the cops work is, suppose a couple of you are involved in a drug deal, right? They arrest you, and they arrest some others, and they start talking to them and say, okay, you're about to go to prison for 10 years. If you will tell us information about someone else so we can arrest someone else, you can go to prison for 2 years. And man, I mean, every time snitches just turn up, and they start snitching on each other. So that was the case with me. I wasn't arrested alone. My roommate was arrested. Another one of our friends was arrested. And they turned and just started blabbering. In fact, they even made up a few apocryphal stories about how terrible I was. Now, granted, I was a bad guy, but goodness gracious, they were making up some real crazy stuff. If you look at the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, though, we have something different. The people who knew Christ the best would have been his disciples, right? We have people that claim to have seen Christ after he was resurrected. We have people that ate with him, that stuck their fingers in the wounds. If indeed Christ was not dead, buried, and resurrected, these people would know about that, right? They would be in on this conspiracy to say that Christ is really just kind of a liar, a lunatic, a legend, or something. So these disciples are going around all over the place, and they're talking about Jesus. And a lot of them got arrested, a lot of martyrs, right? John got off easily because he got exiled. He went to prison, to prison, to prison, to prison. And he never snitched on Jesus. All he had to do was say, okay, Jesus is not really resurrected, and he could have gotten out of prison. I know all sorts of people that would have taken that deal, if indeed Jesus was not resurrected. Peter, one of Christ's closest followers, was arrested, thrown into prison. They tortured his wife and kids in front of him, and he did not squeal on Jesus, right? In fact, they eventually crucified him. And he said, I'm not worthy of crucifixion. That's how Jesus died. Crucify me upside down. So that's what they did. Paul, who met Jesus on the road to Damascus, was eventually beheaded. Andrew was crucified in Turkey, I believe it was. We had the disciples going to India, getting martyred, going to England, getting martyred, and none of them snitched on Jesus. If indeed Jesus wasn't resurrected, one of them would have snitched, right? So whenever I was faced with this evidence, I could not, with any degree of academic integrity, say that Jesus was not resurrected. It takes the amount of common sense that a prisoner would have to figure this out, right? So, whenever you realize that Jesus is indeed resurrected, a lot of other things fall into place, right? If someone comes back from the dead, you should probably listen to what he has to say. So I reconsidered Christianity, came to the conclusion, okay, Christianity is indeed the truth. I need to follow what the Bible says. And I didn't want anybody to have to live the life that I was living. I chose this terrible life because I just didn't think I could believe the Bible anymore. This is why apologetics is so important to us. And I decided that whenever I get out, I want to dedicate my life to getting the word out about Christ. So I used my GI Bill to go to UT Arlington, study Russian, and within a week of finishing probation, I moved to Ukraine. Got a secular job, just want to get my feet on the ground, figure out the needs and opportunities. That's where I met Lena. We fell in love, all that mushy stuff, got married. And we've been having fun ever since. We started working with the ministry in 2013. Then in 2016, so last year, we split off from that ministry over some doctrinal and vision issues, and we started Grace Abroad Ministries. Lena was in Kiev. She had just finished studying at a Bible college there, and she was working as a translator, so her English is better than mine, goodness. And her theological English is great, and she knows doctrine too, so Grace Abroad Ministries is the name of the ministry that we started, and we do translation, teaching, and outreach. On the translation front, we've recently launched the first ever online Russian language magazine that teaches free grace and dispensational theology. It's called etlibros.com. So if any of you are Russian speakers, go to etlibros.com and you can read stuff. Among the articles, we've got a couple of different authors that we translate, and Randy White is one of them. So we put up some of his articles, Why We Die, How to Join a Church by Randy White. You can see those on randywhiteministries.com. Did I get that right? In Ukraine, we have kind of a bad reputation, we dispensationalists. People say that dispensationalism is just this dry, boring theology with no real practical implications. And we don't think that's really true. So we try to combine practical living stuff like how to join a church with theology. Why do we die? There's a lot of theological reasons that we die and a lot of implications that carry on into our life because of it. So that's something that we're doing now, bi-weekly. So every other week we launch a new article in Russian for the Russian-speaking world to see. And we're reaching people all over the place. We're getting all sorts of positive and negative feedback. Russian language is kind of the back door to a lot of the stand countries. I was talking to a friend working in Kabul, Afghanistan recently, and he said that Russian is kind of the main second language that people speak there. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all of these Muslim countries are out there in Central Asia. So we've written a few things about Islam and can we trust the Bible? And a lot of Muslims have called me a psychopath for that. But there are a lot of people in Russia and Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus as well that come from this weird sort of post-Soviet, atheistic, Eastern Orthodox mixture. And we're helping people see that the Bible is indeed a reliable document that can help us understand life better. Another translation project that we're working on is a book called Salvation versus Discipleship by Lucas Kitchen, one of our board members. It's very important that we rightly divide the word of truth. Of course, as dispensationalists, we rightly divide the dispensations, but it's also important that we divide doctrines. Salvation is by grace through faith, and discipleship involves our participation. So right now, one of our big translation projects is a book that rightly divides those two, to help people understand that, hey, yeah, this verse is talking about discipleship, this verse is talking about salvation. You don't combine them together to get salvation through discipleship. So we're working on that one. We got another book in the works by the same author on Thomas about doubt, which is something that a lot of people struggle with. So we got some really exciting stuff on the book front. In the past year, we've translated 3 books by Zane Hodges. Anyone familiar with Zane Hodges? He's kind of a champion of free grace theology that wrote a lot in the 80s and 90s. So we've translated those books. We've got 1,000 copies going all over Ukraine. We're getting all sorts of positive feedback and negative feedback. Anytime you tell someone that you just can't work hard enough to earn salvation, you're going to get some backlash. But we're getting a lot of feedback as well. Oh, wow, this is just liberating news. So that's kind of what's going on the translation front. We do translation, teaching, and outreach. The way that teaching has kind of come to be in our ministry. We'll open our apartment whenever we're in Ukraine to have the church come in and we can have Bible studies in a nice, comfortable environment. I had the opportunity to go to a camp that another ministry was hosting. So one of the good things about being a parachurch organization is you can help other people. You're not restricted to one little group. So, in fact, the talks that I'm doing today are actually English translations of talks that I did down in a camp in southern Ukraine. So we typically define teaching as teaching Christians, which, if things are healthy, turn into outreach, which is evangelism, reaching non-Christians. And this is taken various forms as well, in the forms of using English as a second language to reach people. The English language is a really valuable tool today, and a lot of people want to learn English, especially in Ukraine. Whenever I first moved to Ukraine, I was an English teacher, so I've got experience in the field. And I've been able to teach English to various crowds and bring them in and talk about the gospel. We also try to provide opportunities for our church friends to invite their non-church friends to a little gathering where we can come, sit down, meet each other. In this picture, we're playing the board game Risk. Have you ever played Risk? Risk is a great game. The first time I ever heard about Ukraine was from playing Risk. And I'll tell you this much, the Risk board is wrong. Ukraine is not this monstrosity that reaches from Western Europe all the way to Siberia. No. It's still a fun game, though. So we'll invite people in, play a fun game, have a little lighthearted activity, and just sort of build relationships and build a bridge where believers and non-believers can meet each other. That way it's not so scary whenever we say, hey, would you like to go to a Bible study or an evangelism event? We're not a bunch of weirdos. We've played Risk together. We also have a son, Oliver. He's 5 months old. He's ridiculously cute, so I have to throw in Oliver pictures however much I can. So we love him to death. He's so much fun. We miss him. We actually left him behind in Oklahoma to come up here. So we're looking forward to getting back with him because he's so much fun. And really, family, it's your first line of ministry. It's the best discipleship opportunity we have. He's only 5 months old now, so it's a lot of fun watching him grow. So yeah, that's who we are. Grace Abroad Ministries, who do translation, teaching, and outreach. If you would like to follow our blog, you can at themileses.com. Yeah, there it is. www.themileses.com. We post theology and recipes and everything in between. And graceabroad.org is our ministry website. So, thank you for not booing. We just talked about higher criticism, the authority of the original documents, and the next portion we'll be talking about lower criticism, the reliability of the manuscripts and the copies that we have of those documents. So, thank you.